terms of the ideas which are and were underlying it. If we think of the structure of the process, this becomes immediately obvious. If we can think back to the first and still most important success of the Middle East peace process, namely the Israeli agreement with Egypt of 1979, it becomes immediately obvious that this peace between Israel and Egypt was the result, first and foremost, of the decision by the then Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, to take his country from the pro-Soviet side in the Cold War over to the pro-American side. This was, in fact, the important decision that Sadat took, and once he'd taken that decision, the subsequent contacts with Israel followed on almost as a matter of course. And if we take a step forward then and look at the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, well, this connection to the overall American domination of the region becomes yet more obvious. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process, of course, born precisely in the moment following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ending of the Cold War, and the situation of uncontested American domination of the region, and then the Palestinian decision to, again, with nowhere else really to go, to come on board with the Americans, to accept the pro-Western side in the region, and therefore to speak with Israel, to try to make peace with Israel as a matter of course. Well, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process failed as a result of its own internal contradictions. We can perhaps discuss or disagree about who precisely is responsible or where things went wrong, but probably everyone can agree that at the end of the day, the maximum which mainstream Israel found itself able to give, to offer Palestinians in return for peace, was less than the minimum which the mainstream Palestinian nationalism felt itself able to accept, and as a result, the process collapsed. And here in this city and here in this country, we experienced a subsequent half-decade of low-intensity warfare. This is the proper name for it, but also it goes here by the name of the Second Intifada. In terms of the ideas underlying the peace process also being a result of, I would say, American domination of the region, this is perhaps a little bit more nebulous point. But those of you, we all probably remember that time and the strange optimism which pertained in the region and in the world in the early 1990s. This was the time of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history and the last man, if people are familiar with that essay. The notion that conflicts that had been resistant to solution would now prove amenable to solution. It seems very distant now, that moment. But this also, I would suggest, was a product of the sense that the American way, the Western way, was the only game in town. What I wish to suggest to you is that what is currently taking place in the region is a challenge, an overall challenge to this situation of Western and American domination of the region, which has underlain and made possible the very idea of the peace process. What is the force, or which are the forces which are challenging this Western dispensation in the region? I wish to suggest to you that we have two related forces which are issuing this challenge to Western domination of the region, and of course also to Israel as a part of that structure. The first of these is the rise to prominence in the regime in Iran of a very radical, ambitious and ideological element. And the second related process is the Islamization of regional politics. That's to say, in country after country, the rising to prominence of various movements committed to one or another form of political Islam. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit now about both of these processes. First of all, with regard to Iran. Who or what is this new elite which is on the rise in Iran, of which President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who you have all heard of, is only the most prominent or well-known representative? This rising elite within Iran, within the Iranian regime, is first and foremost a generational group. It is the group of men, and all of them are men, whose formative experience was participation in the Islamic Revolution of 1979 as young men, as young activists, and subsequently participation in the very bloody and terrible Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. This was their formative experience, the forge in which they were made. And now, these men in late middle age are ascending to the top of the pinnacle of the regime, which as young men they helped to create. That is to say, they are reaching, not all of them of course, but those of them who have made it through the system are now reaching the top positions of the regime which they helped to create. As they do so, as they reach this summit, they look around themselves at the country which they have helped to create, or regime they helped to create, and what do they see? What they see is failure. What they see is failure. That is to say that the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, in its own words, was supposed to usher in the rule of the righteous and the rule of the pure. What it has in fact ushered in is an immensely corrupt, immensely inefficient, and immensely unpopular Islamist regime in Iran. The project which these men now ascending to the top in Iran wish to set before themselves is the project to revive the original fire of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in order to revive the fortunes of the regime which they are coming to control. For those of us, and we are all, most of us here are not in the first flush of youth, we can say, we've all done a bit of living. So for those of us who, without wishing to insult anybody, well, I'm not, and you're all young people, that's it. Unlike young people like yourselves, those of us who've done a bit of, we have all seen phenomena throughout the world. And we know from looking at history that in revolutionary regimes, there is often a tremor 10 or 20 years after the revolution itself. If we think of the Cultural Revolution in China in the late 60s, if we think of enforced collectivization in Russia in the late 30s, because there's a kind of a moment when the revolutionaries look around themselves and realize things haven't turned out as we wanted them to turn out. And then an idea is born to try to revive the original fire which made the revolution itself. Now this project is always unsuccessful because, as some of us at least here know, when you are 40, you can't just decide to be 20. It doesn't work. But if you are 40 and you decide to be 20 again, it won't work, but you can maybe create a great deal of havoc on the way to establishing this country. This is what is currently taking place in Iran, a desire to revive the original fire of the revolution. One of the tools which this regime wishes to employ in this goal is that of Iranian foreign policy. That is to say, it wants to make to bring the regime and bring the country power across the region as a way of reviving, as a tool for reviving the fortunes of this regime. This is where Israel comes into the picture, as we will see in a moment. Thus far with regard to Iran. With regard to the second phenomenon I spoke about, that of the rise of political Islam, it's a simpler and more obvious phenomenon with which you are all familiar. The fact of the matter is that in country after country in the Middle East, if free elections were held tomorrow, the victor in those elections would be one or another form of political Islam. This is the case in Lebanon, this is the case in Jordan, this is probably the case in Egypt, etc., etc., etc. Now it is the meeting point of these two processes. Firstly, the rise of an ambitious new elite in Iran from above, and secondly, the presence of popular Islamist movements in country after country in the region, which I would argue is transforming the Middle East, is issuing the challenge to the pro-American dispensation which has held sway since the early 90s, and which is also issuing a challenge to Israel and transforming Israel's strategic situation. Here is where we come into the picture as Israelis and as Jews. But why do we come into the picture? We have no border with Iran. We are on the other side of the region from Iran. As Jews, we also have no historic account with the Iranians, with the Persians. That's to say, insofar as we have a historic account, and I know everybody here knows the Bible, so we know that actually, insofar as there is a historic account between Jews and Persians, it is largely positive, because it was King Cyrus and the Persians who were the ones who destroyed the very oppressive Babylonian Empire in ancient days and took Jerusalem from the Babylonians, and therefore made it possible for the Jews in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah to come back to the land. Generally, the history is positive. Why then do we come into the picture with regard to this Iranian regime and its ambitions? Here is why. Iran, when it issues its ambitions in the Middle East, has a problem. In fact, it has two problems. The Iranians are not Arabs, and they are not Sunni Muslims. They want to become the dominant power in a region consisting largely of Arabic-speaking Sunni Muslims. They have a third problem, which is they're not Arabs, they're not Sunni Muslims, and they're not even strangers. They can't come along to the region the way that the Americans once did and say, look, you don't know us very much, you don't know us, but you'll find that we're okay. Because actually the Arabs do know the Persians very well, have a long history with them, and don't like them at all. Unlike, in our case, the Arab encounter with the Persians is largely one of enmity and grudge and conflict. The Iranian regime considers, and probably correctly, that there is one issue, and one issue alone, which can trump, potentially trump, their essential their essential unpopularity amongst the Arabs. And that issue is the issue of the Palestinian cause. Unfortunately for us, this cause of Palestinian nationalism remains the most emotive and thought about cause amongst millions of people in the Arab world. The Iranians therefore consider that if they can grab the banner of the Palestinian cause, if they can become the leader, so to speak, of the Palestinian cause, this would be a shortcut for them to implant themselves in the hearts of the peoples of the region. They have been engaged in this for some time. The model which they are adopting is one of sponsoring